Hello from me, Lazar Hristov. We continue with the next lesson of the CSS course. Last time we started Chapter 8, How to Make Elements Available on a Web Page, and we reached the second point, New Elements, New Modules for the Layout of Elements in CSS 3. In addition to these layouts, real sites also have very complex and various layouts. In some of them we have a multi-column layout, and there are also variants in which some columns are merged. In other variants there is also multi-block layout, in which the blocks themselves are also not the same, but have various sizes and are arranged in different ways. Here is an example of such scheme that you can look at. And which has quite complex transitions and variations. Except for the more complex mockups, due to the strange, and unfortunately even established as a standard, idea of creating elementary minimalist designs, such that they adapt to the sizes of all devices, new more complex tools were created, separated as separate modules in CSS 3. We will briefly look at two of them, CSS Flexbox and CSS Grid Layout. Although many layouts can be implemented using Flexbox or Grid, they have their own quirks and are quite complex to master. The main difference between them is that Flexbox is designed for layout in only one dimension, either a row or a column, while Grid is designed for two-dimensional layout, both rows and columns. The two have some common features, so if you've already learned how to use Flexbox, you'll find easier to get to grips with Grid. We continue with Flexbox. It is short for Flexible Box Layout Module. This module is a special, flexible Flex container, which contains Flex elements, which are also flexible. They can be arranged in it in rows or columns, and aligned along a horizontal or vertical axis. With the help of this module, complex adaptive designs can be implemented. Flexbox allows you to accomplish the following tasks. Efficiently manage flex elements inside the container and arrange them, from left to right, or from right to left, or from top to bottom, or from bottom to top. When arranged in columns, it can redefine, change the display order of elements, automatically resize elements to fit into the free space, allows for horizontal and vertical centering of the elements, it can collect elements inside the container without overflowing, it can create columns of the same height and rows of the same length. CSS Flexbox is a complete module and accordingly includes a whole set of different properties, some of which apply to the container itself and others to its elements. But before we continue with their description, it is necessary to familiarize yourself with the concepts used in the Flex container. Here is a schematic representation of the Flexbox model. The main axis is this main axis, which is the axis along which the flexible flex elements are arranged. In this diagram this is the horizontal axis and therefore the horizontal direction is considered to be the main one, since the main axis extends into the main dimension. The basic beginning. Main start. And the main end are the lines that define the starting and end sides of the Flex container, relative to which they are positioned the flexible elements, starting from the main beginning in the direction towards the main end. The main size is the width or height of the flexible container, or of the flexible elements, depending on which of them are in the main dimension. The cross-axis is the vertical axis, which is perpendicular to the main axis and extends in the cross dimension, so here it is. And accordingly it also has a cross start and cross end, beginning and end. The cross size is the width or the height of the flex container, or of the flex elements, depending on which of them are in the cross dimension. In our case, the cross dimension is the height. Creating a flex container. To create a flex container and to manage its elements, we need to use the display property. We've already talked about it, with the flex or inline flex values. Here is an example. The code will be as follows, and in the browser we will see the following. The properties of the flexible flex container are as follows. We will not show them here, we list. Here is an example that will arrange them in a column. Here is the code. Here is an example of a 3-column layout implemented with CSS Flexbox. You can see it in detail here in the PDF file. We won't go into it now. More information can be found, for example, at the following address, and many others. There is currently a lot of material on the internet about CSS Flexbox. CSS Grid Layout Module. This module is a layout system, based on a grid of rows and columns. The grid container contains a set of horizontal and vertical lines, which form the individual grid elements and the distances between them, and allow the elements to be positioned in the form of a grid or table. Grid provides 2D alignment, uses a top-down approach to layout, allows explicit of overlapping elements, and both Flexbox and Grid are flexible approach to the layout of the elements, only, if with Flexbox we have a displacement of the nested elements in one direction, horizontally or vertically, then Grid positions the elements in two directions in the form of rows and columns, forming a table or grid. The full specification of the module. Grid layout can be read at this address. The basis for determining the layout in grid layout is the grid container, in which the grid elements are housed. But before we continue with the description of them, you need to familiarize yourself with the concepts used in the grid container. Here is a schematic of the columns and rows, and the distances between them in the grid container. Here is a schematic of the lines in the grid of the grid container, creating a grid container. To create a grid container we also need to use the property display with a value of grid or inline grid. Here is an example. The code is as follows, and in the browser we will see the following. We have created 5 elements. And the properties of the grid container are as follows. These properties are many and need to be worked a lot practically, until you understand the individual properties and what exactly they are used for. And when should you use which property? But we won't go into that now, because it's a vast topic. A whole book could be written on this subject. To arrange our 5 elements from the previous example in a grid, we will set the number of columns and their widths, using the grid template columns property. The added code will be as follows: grid template columns, auto 50px auto, gap, 10px, only for the second column we have a width set to 50px, and for the others it is automatic. Gap is the distance between the elements. Here we don't have a 6th element. Here's an example of a layout with 3 columns, implemented with grid layout. You can take a look at the code, it's interesting, and in the browser we'll see the same thing, as in the previous example. For more information you can visit this address, and not only that. As I already said, for Flexbox and for grid layout there is also a lot of information on the internet right now. We mentioned very briefly about these 2 modules, because as I said, this is a vast and quite complicated topic for beginners, which can easily be written a separate book, and the goal of the book and my lessons is, to teach you how to create your own website, by examining only the basics of HTML and CSS, but without going into detail about all the modules and possibilities, which, among other things, are still developing and being added to. That's all for this lesson. Best regards.